All right, here we are at MediaCloud.org, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to use two of the tools on MediaCloud to explore the news about a topic and how to use it to identify some useful dimensions of news coverage to compare for your papers. The first tool we're going to use is the MediaCloud Explorer. And I'm just going to click launch now. If you're new to this, you're going to want to create an account. And once you click on launch now, if you don't have an account, you'll be asked to register. I have one, so I'm just going to click log in right here. I'm logged in, and now, simple as any other search tool, I will click on insurrection and search. A few things you want to be aware of when you're using this tool, and just let's start here at the top, right? So here's your search term that you just typed in, insurrection. In this area here is the set of media sources that MediaCloud is going out onto the web and looking at. So it goes out and it searches the web every time you do a search, and you can search different collections of media. So let's just for a minute, let's show you what that looks like. So if we click on that, you'll see right now we are in a group called United States National. I'm going to click on that to show you what is included in that. So this is 271 media sources, and it's all sorts of things, like some weird stuff, right? Like Access Hollywood, that's weird. Alternet, Air Force Times, American Spectator. So it's left, it's right, it's mainstream, it's local, it's highbrow, it's lowbrow. It's a very broad category for news searching, and this is great if you want to get a real broad feeling for the news. On the other hand, we could click on featured collections, and you can see here there are some other options. And for those of you who want to compare something more focused, like how did right-wing media cover these, how did left-wing media, this is where you could do that. So you could look at top news sources, just the papers, again, left, right, center, and if you want to know how Russia did it, you probably have to learn to read Russian. You can also look by geographic sort of location if you want to look in a specific state, but that we're just going to keep it here broad for now. And then of course the last thing you have here is the dates that you want to search, and that's important especially if you're going to look at the Black Lives Matter. That the Floyd killing was May 26th, I believe. And so if you want to compare similar time frames, you might decide on whatever, maybe a week for the insurrection and a week for Black Lives Matter, or you might want to do something slightly different. You have options here in terms of looking at how things are going. Interesting. So the first thing we get then, once we type that in, is just a simple measure of what percentage of news stories mention that word over time. So obviously, let's see now, hold on, let's back it up. You can see it automatically did the 15th, but let's go back to the 6th when it actually happened. Okay, there we go. So the 6th is when it happened. That was sort of late in the day, so it didn't get as much coverage as the next day. Bing, bing, bing. So it has some ups and downs, and then there's sort of the normal decay. Then there's some impeachment, so there's some discussion there. Then, as I mentioned in class, there's this opportunity to look at a sample of stories. And this is a kind of sort of thing where this can jog your mind for what kinds of things are getting talked about. And these will link right out to the news story. So if I open this up in a new tab, ta-da, there you go, right? And that's certainly something, whoops, let's get rid of those. Certainly something you can do, all right? Then another thing you can do is click on language, and this is really interesting because, again, for a content analysis where you're actually going to be looking at words and counting words. That could be one thing you're doing. This is going to give you an interesting sort of insight or look into the kinds of words that are most common in the coverage that you have just had the tool search out, right? So of all the stories that it just went out and looked at, these are the top words. So we could view this as a word cloud. So it's kind of cute. You can actually download that if you want, put it in your paper. I'm happy to see those. The ordered layout is just a little more orderly, so you can really see what's the first one and blah, blah, blah. I don't care which one you use. Word clouds are prettier. The word space tool, as I mentioned, I don't really fully understand this in terms of what I'm supposed to make of it's just a cute diagram mostly, but the thing that it does, and you can't report this because there are no numbers to give, right, just from the diagram. But the point here is to show you which of these words go together most often. So if this is just words in terms of pure popularity of use, these are how closely connected these words are. So you see these words all happen in the same stories usually, right? And these stories, violent, mob, supporters, armed, those all happen. Democrat, Republican, Senate, Congress, Capitol, those all happen in the same one, right? So those are interesting too, because if you want to know, for example, how often does the word race and justice appear in the same story during Black Lives Matter versus Capitol insurrection, right? This is the kind of tool that gives you a sense of what words go together in one of them, and then you can see how often it is true in the other one as well. So that's an interesting thought. Down here, top themes. This is very, very high level. This is kind of like, Wikipedia like level themes. That's not going to be interesting for our project, I don't believe. And then finally, entities. Entities are people and organizations in the sort of database world. So this is just going to give you a list of the most popularly or most often mentioned people and organizations in the coverage. If this ever happens, this is scary how long this takes. I'm operating on an Ethernet internet connection, which is very, very fast. This is all on MediaCloud's side that this is taking a long time. And my patience is wearing thin. As I showed people in class, it'll also show you a map of the world with a heat map, but since our coverage is all American, you won't see anything but the US lit up, so it doesn't matter. All right, I've run out of patience for this one, but you get the idea. When you run it, in theory anyway, you're gonna, let's probably refresh it, maybe it'll happen quicker. There we go. So no surprises really. Trump, most common, and organizationally, interesting, right? So that's very interesting. That could be something you might want to look at. As I said, this, if we chose a global sort of, you can add different media things. So if you had a whole bunch, you could kind of do a comparison. It's like Google News. You can also use Google News to do these kind of things. So that's interesting. All right. So as I said, that's kind of. Let me go back here for 1 second. So the attention thing. One thing I want to call your attention to is the fact that what they've done here is instead of raw story numbers, what they're doing is telling you what percentage of all news stories mention insurrection. And the reason it's important to do that is that, and this isn't something you would normally think of, but once you start doing this kind of research, it becomes frustratingly obvious, is that the number of news stories in the news changes quite radically day by day for various reasons that are totally, not obvious to me. So the other thing is in news databases also, sometimes what happens is that the number of, the number of sources the database contains changes from year to year, week to week, as, the coverage of the New York Times goes back 30 years, but maybe this other newspaper only goes back 15 years. So if you ask it how many stories recently, it's always a much bigger number, but it's not a bigger number per newspaper. So in order to get a scientifically sort of accurate sense of how much attention, it's better to use what percentage of the total stories contain a word. And I'll talk about that again when we talk about the coding in another module of the tutorial here. But just so you know, there is a view option to ask how many stories. I don't we don't want that, because that doesn't actually really mean very much to anyone. No one knows how many news stories there are per day. So what does it really mean that there's 1,000 or 1,200 that mention insurrection? There's thousands of news outlets, right? So I don't know what that means. But if you tell me 10% of all stories in the U.S. media mention this topic, then I'm like, oh, that number I can make use of in my head, right? Especially if you compare it to something else and you go, well, there was 10% of the stories the day after the insurrection mentioned the insurrection, and 20% of the stories after the George Floyd killing mentioned George Floyd. Now that's a comparison that really makes a lot of sense. All right, so now I'm going to show you the second tool that you could use if you liked, and that's the topic mapper. The topic mapper is a different beast entirely, and you actually need to set it up. What you do is something fairly similar. You would create a new topic, and you would give it a search term and some dates, and then it goes away and does its thing, and it crawls the web for gazillions of stories over time and does some more analysis that you don't get when you're just doing the Explorer. So it does the Explorer piece, but then it does some more analysis. And so I've already done one of these, and so I will click on that and show you the results of one of those topic mapper web crawls. And we're getting there. Okay, so it has gone out and found 10,637 stories from 723 outlets, and you can learn more about all those sorts of things, right? And in this one, we get a different, deeper set of things going on. And as I showed you before, you can look at top stories. And this is an interesting way to get a sense of what the most sort of compelling topics were over a time frame. And the way they measure that is a couple different ways. How many other places link to that story, and then how many times it was shared on Facebook. So if we just click on the Facebook one, you can see that the top story was shared almost 300,000 times from the Atlantic. Washington Post has one, almost 200, CNN 180, and so on. And you can click on each of those and go read and get a sense, or you can kind of just scan these, and those could give you thoughts about what kind of topics and dimensions to compare the stories on. Oops, something went wrong. Why would that happen? Do you know it? I didn't do that. Well, this is sometimes live science, guys. Live science. All right, hold on. No, that's not what I meant to do. Well, okay. Topic mapper. Well, let's try to get back to it. All right. It's going to say a lot about my morning if I have time to edit that out or not. Okay, let's see if I can pay attention. There we go. So that's a more sort of long run, interesting tidbit there. Entities. They tell you a little bit more about how they came up with these things. And again, we're going to get this infinitely annoying tidbit. Stats. No, not very interesting. Entities. That's going to be the same thing. At any rate, okay. I think this is the most interesting part, the influence thing. This is why I showed it to you. Forget the other stuff. So this is another way to go about it. So that's how to use MediaCloud. In the next module, I'm going to show you how to use another database called Factiva that I think is also really interesting and useful for finding concepts and dimensions of the news to study, but also is probably the easiest way to actually download the news content so that you actually have it in a document so that you can do an easier job actually coding the news stories when you get there. And I will show that to you in just a minute.